Alright, so today I want to introduce you to the Dragonfly ball python. The Dragonfly actually consists of three genes: the fire, the pastel, and the pinstripe. And essentially what it is, it's a lemon blast with the pastel and the pinstripe with the addition of fire. And when you add fire to a lemon blast, you really clean it up and really brighten the background. Makes for a really impressive snake. And if you're actually trying to reproduce dragonflies, it can get a little bit tricky because you actually have three genes. And if you breed it into something else, your odds aren't really in your favor. You can actually reproduce it. Maybe one egg in a clutch, you'll actually get a dragonfly. But if you actually start mixing other genes into the mix, it's a little bit harder to reproduce the dragonfly and work other genes into the mix. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump over the internet and I want to show you the potential of the dragonfly ball python. Alright, so I want to jump over here on Morphmarket.com and I want to show you the three genes that make up the dragonfly. The first one I want to show you is the fire. The fire is a pretty awesome morph. As a matter of fact, if you put a fire right next to a normal, you can usually tell the difference between a fire and the wild type normal ball python. The fire usually has either kind of a more yellow or kind of a more creamy color to the background. Seems like every time I headshot a fire, it almost looks more of a vanilla color as far as the background. And if you actually breed two fires together, you get a super fire, which is an all-white snake with black eyes. The fire is also allelic to a few genes. As a matter of fact, if you breed a fire to like a disco or a vanilla, you get allelic complexes, which is kind of really scrambles up the pattern. With the vanilla, you actually get the vanilla cream, which is the vanilla in the fire. And if you actually breed it to a disco, you get the disco inferno, which is the disco fire, which is pretty amazing. It's pretty versatile morph. And as a matter of fact, I think fire is probably one of the most underrated. You look at it as a standalone morph and you really can't see the potential of the fire, especially when you mix it in with other combos. So another gene in the dragonfly is the pastel. And when it comes to pastels, I'd say probably every single collection of ball pythons has at least one ball python with pastel in it. And pastel really brings out a lot of the yellow color. In a lot of cases, it really reduces the pattern, makes for some really amazing combos. And the last gene in the dragonfly is the pinstripe. This is the pinstripe. The pinstripe is actually dominant. So if you breed it to something, half the offspring come out as pinstripes. As a matter of fact, all three genes, if you breed it to something else, you'll get 50% of all the genes and combinations of all three if you're actually breeding the dragonfly. And the pinstripe is probably one of the most versatile genes. It mixes really well with a lot of combos and it's really inexpensive. Usually you can pick up pinstripes for probably less than $100 in most cases. So if you actually take all three genes, the fire, the pastel, and the pinstripe, put them all in one snake, this is what you get. You get a dragonfly. And look at this crazy snake. This thing is screaming. It is pretty amazing. Probably one of the most amazing three gene combos that you can get. And it's kind of interesting, some of these dragonflies are really super bright and some of them are not that bright. It's kind of interesting the differences between kind of the versions of the dragonfly. And if you're kind of wondering, you know, if you actually take this dragonfly and breed it to something else, what the odds are, I actually brought up this genetic calculator over here so you can kind of see the odds. I came over here to the World of Ball Pythons genetic wizard, which is pretty cool. And a lot of people in my comments are asking me, hey, what happens if I breed these two snakes together? You can actually come over here and you can actually go to Google and search for genetic wizard ball python. It'll bring you over to this page and you can just type in any genes for the male, any genes for the female. And in this case, I actually put in the genes for the dragonfly for the male and just left the female blank, which is a normal, classic, wild type. And you hit calculate, and this is actually what it gives you. This is actually what you get. You get 8 different combos as far as the possibilities of breeding the dragonfly. You get normals, pinstripes, pastels, fire. You get the lemon blast, which is the pastel pinstripe. You get the firefly, which is the fire and the pastel. And you get the fire pinstripe, and then 1 out of 8 you'll actually reproduce the offspring, the fire, pastel, and pinstripe. And if you actually breed this to something else, trying to work another gene into the Dragonfly, your odds are double. You're actually 1 in 16 chance that you'll actually hit the Dragonfly with another gene in it. So for example, if you're actually shooting for adding another gene into the Dragonfly, it may take you 2 clutches of eggs, you know, kind of an average of 8 eggs per clutch to actually hit something else with the Dragonfly. A little bit more difficult to actually work with just because of the number of genes. So if you actually took the Dragonfly and you bred it to a fire, take a look at this. This is actually what you would get. You would get a super fire Dragonfly. A Dragonfly, it's essentially what it is if you actually make a super fire, what it does is it masks all the other genes and you end up with a completely white snake with black eyes. So as a matter of fact, this one, I was kind of wondering, are they guessing on the pastel and the pinstripe, or do they know for sure this actually has pastel and pinstripe? And a lot of times when you hit the super fire or the blue-eyed leucistics, a lot of times you can't tell if it has other genes. You can have 10 other genes in the snake and it wouldn't change it. You'd still have a white snake with black eyes, unless maybe you mixed in albino or something that would actually change the eye color. So it's a little bit difficult to actually work with. So take a look at this one. This is actually called a sherbet fly. And this one's kind of interesting because if you actually take a Dragonfly and you breed it to a pastel, you know, potentially you could get a super pastel version of the Dragonfly. And that's what this is. This is the sherbet fly. So this actually has the fire, the super pastel, and the pinstripe in the mix. Kind of a little bit difficult to hit, but it makes for a really amazing snake. So take a look at this. This is actually the same exact genes, the fire, the super pastel, and the pinstripe. You can actually call it the sherbet fly, or you could call it the super Dragonfly. Now we're kind of going down the rabbit hole of all these different names that you can name a snake, and this, especially when you get into the Dragonflies and the combos that you can actually make, it gets a little bit complicated. So this is actually the super Dragonfly, which it's called, you know, the super pastel. You can also call it the Fire Killer Blast, is another name for the sherbet fly. This is actually the fire, the super pastel, and the pinstripe. And if you actually look at the genes in this, the super pastel and the pinstripe is actually called a Killer Blast. So you can actually call it a Fire Killer Blast. And here's another name you can actually name it a Super Blast Fire. So, you know, some people actually call the combination of super pastel and pinstripe, they call that a Killer Blast. You can also call it a Super Blast. And you could either call this a Fire Super Blast or a Super Blast Fire, kind of interchangeable. It gets a little bit confusing when you have the same genes. You know, you go back to the sherbet fly, and as a matter of fact, this is kind of interesting. If you look at the sherbet fly, just the color and the intensity and the pattern, and you look at the different examples of the same exact genes, it's pretty amazing from one version to another how it really changes. I'm thinking it might be, you know, due to the different lines of pastel. You know, some lines of pastel are really super bright, and then some of them are a little bit browned out. And there may be different versions of fire and pinstripe, especially in these multi-gene combos. You see a lot of different examples of the same combination, which is kind of interesting. So here is the spider ball python. You can actually mix the spider in with the dragonfly. The spider is a dominant morph, so if you breed it to something else, 50% of the offspring come out as spiders. And the spiders have this really crazy spider web pattern right down the top of the snake. And usually it's really visually dominant when you're mixing it with other combinations. A lot of times you can actually see the spider kind of, you know, pushing through. You can definitely see spider. And a lot of times the spider will have a little bit of a head wobble. Sometimes you'll see that the heads are not completely level on some spiders. And if you're kind of wondering if you have spider in your mix of the different genes, if it completely masks the spider, a lot of times if you have just a little slight head wobble, sometimes that is an indication that you actually have spider in the mix. And here's what happens if you mix spider in with a dragonfly. You essentially get a spider dragonfly, and there's a lot of different names for the spider dragonfly. You can also call it the Firefly Spinner. Really, really amazing snake, and it's pretty incredible, the different versions of the spider dragonfly. Some of them are really kind of a white, kind of washed out, and some of them have quite a bit of color to them, really variable. And if you actually take a look at the genes in this, the fire and the pastel is called the Firefly. And you actually add the pinstripe, that's called the Dragonfly. And if you actually have the pinstripe and the spider, that is called the Spinner. So you can actually call this the Firefly Spinner. And there's, believe it or not, there's more names you could actually name this. Here's another one. You could actually name it a Spinner Blast Fire, which is kind of confusing because, yeah, as a matter of fact, the spider, the pastel, and the pinstripe is also called the Spinner Blast. So you have the fire and the Spinner Blast. Or you could actually call this one, I was just thinking of this, you can actually call it the Fire Spider Lemon Blast, because the pastel and the pinstripe is the lemon blast. And all these names, it kind of, you go down the rabbit hole and it kind of makes your head spin with all the different possibilities when you start getting into it. And speaking of possibilities, it gets even more confusing when we add lesser to the mix. Here is a lesser ball python. The lesser is in the blue-eyed leucistic. So, you know, with a fire, you kind of have to be careful. If you breed it with another fire, you get the white snake. But if you actually mix lesser in with combos, you have to really be careful, because lesser is in the blue-eyed leucistic, and if you breed it with something else in the blue-eyed leucistic like Russo or Mojave or Bamboo, there's a whole bunch of different genes. You'll get an all-white snake with blue eyes that masks all the other genes in the combo. So some people actually go after, you know, if you're just kind of breeding a few genes and you want the all-white snake, you can do it. But a lot of people, if they're breeding like 5 or 6 or 7 genes in combos, a lot of times they'll actually avoid the white snake because it masks all of the other genes. And this is what happens if you mix lesser in with a dragonfly. Take a look at this beauty. This is the lesser dragonfly. So this actually is the lesser, and then the dragonfly is the fire, the pastel, and the pinstripe. And there's quite a few different ways you can actually name the lesser dragonfly. And take a look at this. This is actually the same exact snake, but it's also called the Emperor Pin Fire. So you look at the, it gets a little bit confusing. The lesser, pastel, and pinstripe, a lot of people call that the Emperor or the Emperor Pin. So as a matter of fact, you can call this the Fire Emperor or the Fire Emperor Pin, or some people actually would call this the Fire Emperor Pinstripe, or you can actually name it the Fire Queen Pin, which is another name, or you can actually name it the, let's see, you could actually do the Fire Lesser Lemon Blast. There's a lot of different names for this one snake, and sometimes it's really confusing if you go to the reptile shows, and sometimes you just have to ask the guy behind the table, hey, what is that snake? What are the genes in that Emperor Pin Fire? Because the kind of the slang names can be really tricky, and there's a lot of different slang names for the same combo. So here is the yellow belly, and the yellow belly is actually one of those morphs. It's kind of a sleeper morph. By itself, it looks almost like a normal ball python, but when you mix it into a lot of combos, you actually really enhance the yellow, the brightness of the snake. And here's what happens when you mix yellow belly in with a dragonfly. And take a look at this snake. It's kind of interesting because a lot of times you really can't tell what the effect is because you don't know what line of, I think it comes down to the pastel in the snake and the line of fire. So I think it's really variable from one snake to another as far as how bright you can actually make it. But let me tell you, if you actually add yellow belly to almost anything with fire and pastel, you definitely make it a lot more brighter and a lot more cleaner too. So here is the calico ball python. When it comes to calico, essentially what happens is the calico brings white up on the sides of the snake, and sometimes you can have a high white calico, sometimes you can have a low white, and a lot of people assume that calico is pretty much the same thing as sugar. You can pretty much interchange sugar and calico. It's just a different line of calico. Here's what happens if you work calico in with the dragonfly, and take a look at this crazy snake. That is pretty amazing. I really like how it really brings up the white, and you can definitely see in this version it has a really high white version of the calico, really bringing a lot of the white up on the sides and bringing all the color right to the back. Makes for a really impressive combo. And keep in mind, this is actually 4 genes. So this is the calico, the fire, the pastel, and the pinstripe. So, you know, with any of these combos, you can actually make a lot of different names. They actually named this one the Firefly Calico Pinstripe, which is essentially the Calico Dragonfly. So here is the bamboo. As a matter of fact, this picture is a picture of Bobby that I always have around my neck at the beginning and the end of the videos. I actually bought him over here from Breeder's Circle over on Morphmarket. As a matter of fact, when I bought him, he was an adult, over 1,000 grams, and I was breeding him right out of the chute. I think within 2 months that I had him, he was actually breeding a lot of my females, and he was kind of going crazy. He actually, I think I bred him to like 10 females, and he would lock and stay locked for days. I've never seen a breeder as crazy as Bobby. He's pretty crazy. Here's what happens if you actually work bamboo into the Dragonfly. Take a look at this. This is kind of interesting because when you mix bamboo into a lot of combos, bamboo is really visually dominant. And you can definitely tell in this case, you can definitely tell the bamboo is almost overwhelming all the other genes in the mix. You can definitely tell there is the pinstripe. The pinstripe and the bamboo work together really well to really break up the pattern. But if you actually add, you know, the pastel and the bamboo is really tough to actually see it at all. And the fire just kind of lightens the background in a lot of combos and cleans it up. Makes for an interesting combo. So here's the last combination I want to show you, and that is the addition of Inchi to the Dragonfly. Probably one of my favorite combinations. And Inchi, essentially what it does is it really reduces the pattern. You can see on this one, it really reduces it to almost bands on the sides of the snake. And the Inchi also brings out a lot of the yellow and the orange color in a lot of combinations. It's actually pretty surprising when you start adding it into combos. And here is what happens if you add Inchi into the Dragonfly. Take a look at this crazy snake. That is one of the most amazing dragonflies that I've seen. Really brings out a lot of the color, just super bright. That thing is almost glowing, and you can definitely see the bands from the Inchi coming through and really reducing the pattern. Makes for a really amazing snake. Alright, so it is time for the question of the day. And Xenomorphic asks, is there any way to tell the age of a ball python? And that is a very good question. As a matter of fact, when it comes to the age of a ball python, it's really difficult to tell an old snake from a young snake. And kind of the exception would be if you actually had a fairly big snake like this one. I'd say this one is at least maybe 3 or 4 years old. This is Bobby, my bamboo ball python. And this, as a matter of fact, this snake's about 7. But the kind of the interesting thing is I've actually seen ball pythons that are really super old, like 35 to 40 years old, and they're not even close to the size of Bobby. And I've actually seen just the opposite too, really small ball pythons that are pretty old and still almost hatchling size. As a matter of fact, I bought one over on Craigslist that was almost 2 years old, and the guy was feeding it a mouse, a small mouse, once a month. And it was pretty incredible that that snake was so old and so small for the age. And kind of the interesting thing with snakes is, you know, if you actually had a dog and you didn't feed it enough, the dog would continue to grow, like the skeleton would grow and grow, and the kind of the ribs would stick out, and you'd see it's a really skinny, big dog. You can tell it was underfed. And it's kind of just the opposite with ball pythons. If you actually underfeed a snake, a lot of times if you're feeding them on a regular schedule and just stretching out the meals, a lot of times the snake will actually stay a really small size and look completely healthy, even though it's kind of an older snake, which is kind of a weird thing with ball pythons. And as a matter of fact, I've seen a lot of people kind of limit feeding reticulated pythons. I've seen some older mainland reticulated pythons that people are feeding like once a month, and I don't really recommend it, but it's pretty amazing if you actually look at those snakes and look at the body condition. A lot of times they really don't look like an underfed animal like you would expect. They look pretty healthy, especially for their age. It's pretty amazing how you can feed a snake to really affect the size and the growth rate of that snake. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.